So looking at systems and scale, I'm going to dive right in. Comments in the chat box, if you have some, I hope you do. Right, I got a nice little boost, or if you like, call it that, from Walter Stahel, one of my heroes and perhaps a godfather of the circular economy. He commented on this little summary of what I think we're about in circular economy, and that's a great game you can play, guess what the circular economy is, all day long. But I'm suggesting it's drawing on notions of systems thinking. Well, I don't think that's very radical to say that. And it's about circulation. Oh, it's a circular economy. But it's in both monetary and material cycles. And that, I think, is not commonly discussed, and not in a specific sense. And what is creeping through is an economics which supports all this. And that's quite a thing to deal with. And Walter, being very sharp, said, who are the people driving this change? Well, answers on a postcard for that one at the moment, not getting into it just now, but might do at the end. This is one version of what we're told is a pretty typical diagram. I've chosen the EPEA diagram. It's originally Braungart and McDonough. And what I want to do is to say, well, actually, this is the overall picture. And this one even includes carbon movements, and carbon is they make the very important claim that it's an important material, depends how you capture and how you use it. But a lot of the time, circular economy is just focused on that right-hand side, and it's also in the outer loops, if you want to call it that way. So we're spending a lot of our time around business models, recycling, some refurbishing, not so much the other ones. It's talked about a lot, and we're dealing with technical products. Not all the time, of course, because we've got representatives from food systems here. But in terms of attention, the circular economy seems to focus on the technosphere, if you like, and the outer loops, and for big business, or for larger firms, or larger institutions. Now, this doesn't seem terribly balanced, or it might need some additional work. But even worse than that, we haven't really discussed often enough, I feel, the drivers of the linear economy, because in a way you have to deal with them all if you're going to have a circular economy that makes sense, that is a coherent sort of idea, or at least a heuristic to move us further forward. And I list on the right some of the big drivers. It's cheap energy, yes. Cheap credit, we'll come to that in a moment. People often don't accept that, or they don't notice it, oddly. Technological change, that's always in there. You know, you're going to be a disruptor and an innovator, and that's great. And economic growth allows the confidence about loans. You know, if you've got a debt-fueled system and a cheap energy-fueled system, you want to be pretty sure that the money you're putting into it will be repaid with interest. And so economic growth allows more confidence about loans. But at the same time, as we know, the whole thing erodes social and natural capital. It enables scale, of course, and it's been very successful, especially after 1945. So we've got some other big elements there which deserve a word or two. And just a couple of the obvious one on the left, we're not doing particularly well with materials extraction. Where we are now is quite a long way away from where we might be by 2050. I'm not sure it can ever work out like that, but that's one of the circularity gap reports from 2022. This is more of interest to me at the moment is the one on the right. There's a huge amount of debt in the system, and most of it is private debt, by the way, before you get carried away with thinking, oh, this must be governments with their COVID response or something like that. Yes, governments are in there, but a huge amount of debt has been generated by the private sector. And an interesting thing about that is that this debt has grown more rapidly in the era over the past 12, 14 years of very low interest rates. And so we have a highly indebted, supercharged system running on cheap energy, And we also seem to have a very naive view of the economy itself. Now, we said that a lot of circular economy is around the technical products, and it's about the bigger flows and the outer loops, recycling, refurbishing, whatever. But it all seems to happen in a fairly naive economy. We sort of assume there are producers and consumers, and there's government in there, and there'll be some trade, but ignore that for a minute. So this circulates around really quite well. And well, what is there to question? Well, there's quite a lot, actually, because that's not how the economy is structured these days, according to people like Michael Hudson and Dirk Bessemer. There's a huge finance sector, and the finance sector is, so many people say, pretty dominant now, if only because the amount of finance, inverted commas, circulating, the amount of monetary instruments is far in excess of the physical product or the value of the physical product. So you've got finance now dominating, and people call it a financialized capitalism. And more than that, we also have real estates and monopolies. So it looks like the tension is between assets and unearned income. And most of the private credit that has been created has enabled asset prices to increase. Stocks, bonds, shares, real estate particularly. The amount of loans, of course, there's earnings on that in terms of interest. And so Michael Hudson described this unearned surplus that's in there as a return to simply owning something. And the disturbing aspect of it is, it's also a distinguishing characteristic, is that it requires no effort whatsoever. I think Guy Standing said that something near a third of all corporate profits around the world relate to IP or some form of licensing. So it's a very serious situation when finance and real estate monopolies dominate the economy compared to production, consumption, and exchange, which is traditionally where the circular economy operates. And if you wanted to keep going on the doom scale, you could say, well, there are two sources of new money. And the most important one is actually the top, number two, which is banks. Banks create credit out of nothing and put it into the system, mostly for existing assets. And there's also public money creation, which can be very effective in governments which have got stable currencies. And so you've got one of the greatest inventions in human history, which is double entry bookkeeping in a way, and the creation of credit goes back about 5,000 years. And yet we've got a naive view of what the economy really is, and we don't really factor in the financial system as a whole. And Pettifor said recently that you can't fix the environment questions without fixing the financial system. So, okay, you've got mostly focused on technical when we know it should be pretty balanced between the biosphere and the technosphere. We've got the emphasis on outer loops and bigger firms. We've also got the finance system in there, which is very extractive at the moment. That's what economic rents are. They're extracting from the money system and putting it into assets which help deflate the economy because it leaves people with less spending on real goods. And to top it all, investment in productive economy. In Britain, bank loans to the business community represent only about 8 to 10% of the loans, if it's not financial assets or other assets they're purchasing. Well, what about scale? Well, we've very fortunate to have had Sally Gerner pre-record a session. I hope you've had a look at it around this notion of how do systems break down in terms of their functionality. I'm just going to mention one slide on it because you can always pick that presentation up. But the key point she seems to be making, her and other researchers, particularly people who worked in ecology, is that real-world dynamic systems have this sort of shape. They don't just have efficiency as a goal, they have effectiveness as a goal. In other words, to maintain the functionality of the overall system. And they describe that from an analysis of a great number of systems, including the banking system, actually, that the vitality for that system is mostly focused around what they call the window of vitality, which is an interplay between efficiency, streamlining, and diversity, which represents greater resilience. Now, this is quite an interesting idea, because if the mainstream we're looking at goes for gold, it goes for efficiency. What about the thing that's needed to make it work as a system? There's no point in just going for more and more efficiency if the thing falls over, because it becomes more brittle as it becomes more efficient, as we've seen quite often. Just to expand that a bit, here's an image that might help with this. Efficiency, of course, is doing things right, lower costs, but effectiveness is optimizing the whole system. And it's maintaining the system fit. There are sub-levels, and that itself, as the lungs, is nested within the body. All of these have a relationship which is, through evolution, has worked out to be pretty effective. In other words, it maintains the organism. And Gunter Pauli, I think his work is not looked at enough. He feels that we ought to shift from ever lower cost to ever higher generational value with what is locally available. Because he's pointing out that, if you like, most of the action in the economy happens at the smaller scale, at the level of the in the lungs, where air is exchanged for oxygen is exchanged for waste gases, and where the bloodstream interconnects to move both around. And I think this is, if you like, a great missing opportunity in circular economy, to always talk about what does it mean to be effective, and to get away from this efficiency argument. Expanding that a little bit, you could do it with capillaries for blood. The action is the exchange and resilience is located in the periphery, and the bigger vessels support flow and structure. You need both. And there's no good arguing, I would say, between, oh well, we've got to have a locally based economy. We're also going to have a big chunk in that economy too. You're going to have this flow and the structure, because things don't get to be bigger organisms without an interplay between these two. Ignoring one and not dealing with the other is not going to take you very far. So what in this sort of exchange function in the periphery are the enabling conditions? Well, I pick up this from Gunter Pauli and others, but in a word, it boils down to infrastructure of places, workplaces, tools and means of exchange. A whole list there: temporary materials stores, so stuff doesn't flow through, other people can get hold of things; places to learn and try out in relation to food, community kitchens; hacker and fab labs, platform cooperatives; local currencies, public banks; the real sharing economy; redesigned planning zones, affordable houses, and work spaces. This, one would argue, are the things that are needed to enable a thriving economy to build on what is available locally, and to reinforce that opposite pole that we seem to have to drive towards efficiency. So there's other things going on, evidently. The cost of producing something, as the top line here suggests, it's getting cheaper and cheaper. You're getting much more opportunity to have a digitally distributed production system for general needs. I'm not talking about your iPhones. Your iPhones are probably going to still come globally, but so much more can be produced more locally than ever before, at least in an industrial system. I flagged one company there, Biome in London, making construction boards out of mycelium inoculated agricultural waste. It can be done locally. In fact, they're working on partners to deliberately do it locally. They don't want a big company running all this. They want lots of networked, not subsidiaries, but people who take it on and do it in their own regions, fairly autonomously. So using the biocycle and also going down into a modified form of ownership is really helpful. Just since we've got food systems on the go, and examples of, if you go for resilience, you can also get more production. This is George Chan's ideas, which have been tried out 30 to 40 times at a reasonable scale in places like Brazil. And his sadness was, he died a few years ago, he said that, I've proved it, it works. Why isn't anybody listening? And I found that quite hard to read, because what he said was based around livestock manure and wastewater and a biogas digester, we can tie in other forms of revenue. We can tie in other outputs. And so on a relatively limited piece of ground, using fish ponds, biodigesters, and so on, we can increase output. Now, it takes more knowledge, it takes more understanding of different ecological systems, but the point is, he felt he'd shown that it not only generates food products, but its energy needs as well. So there's quite a lot of innovation possible, even just taking something simple as apple forests. There are apple forests, interestingly, in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Tian Shan Mountains. I know of those quite familiar, in a familiar way. And a natural apple forest perhaps doesn't have what we need in terms of production, but what we tend to have is orchards, and its efficiency, the production of one thing or a limited number of apple varieties. But 3D apple orchards, as Gunther Pauli describes these sorts of things, allows us to look all through the different layers to create an effective collection of crop production. In Kazakhstan, there's apple/walnut forests with grazing underneath, which is managed. These have been going on for hundreds of years and are, if you like, they maintain soil quality, they help with biodiversity, and they're very valuable. They're not the most efficient way of doing things, but then that wasn't the question necessarily if we're asking about effectiveness. Dear Paul Mason, he always has a good turn of phrase. And this is interesting. Abundance is taking the price of everything. It's that thing about modern technology, equipment, or whatever, that there is an emerging possibility of free, virtually free, socially produced abundant goods, yet we're faced with a system of monopolies, banks, and government forced to behave desperately to maintain an information asymmetry. In other words, it's a network versus hierarchy situation. In other words, it's about earning economic rents rather than bringing the tools to the people and enabling them to do things. Interestingly, it works out with these complementary opposites. Here, I believe, we tend to have what's on the left-hand side. It's extracting, it's large scale, it's enclosure of the commons, it's accumulate, it's takers. And on the other side, there's a lot of pressure. We don't have as much of the activity on the right-hand side. You're going to have both, is my argument, because they are complementary opposites, but the balance is way to the left, I would argue. And just to pick this up, this sort of theme is picked up by other people. Kate Rayworth, a few years ago, stated the fairly obvious here about the circular economy runs on sunlight, waste, and food, and so on. But she also makes this point, that we ought to distribute value far more equitably among those who co-create it. And this is different forms of ownership, different purposes to these organizations, empowering communities, and expanding the commons. So this is again another statement that we're chasing effectiveness, not just efficiency. Now, just to dive back and to show how difficult it is to get all of this lined up, what would we do about economic rents? We say that the large economy is dominated by people who get returns on just enclosing or owning things, which citizenry have to pay for. We talked about housing, but it's also restricted competition in food processing and onward sale. And a circular economy is potentially, surely, connecting with ideas which are about circularity of the monetary cycle. This idea here, it's a fee dividend approach. It's integrated in the work that the Club of Rome has recently released in the book Earth for All. I was a major contributor to that book. But one of the things in it was about circulation of the monetary system in a somewhat different way. And I'll just exemplify this, and then I'll finish with a couple of quotes. Here you take, say it was carbon, you would you could charge a fee for carbon rich, for natural resource rents. You gather it together, and the novelty here, it's Peter Barnes's work, is you put this in a citizen wealth fund. You don't give it to government directly, because what it is just an ability to take these unearned surpluses and distribute it to everybody as a universal basic dividend, not an income, because it's what everybody is owed as co-owners of the atmosphere or whatever. It's essentially taking economic rents and recirculating it, but doing it so that both sides of, or many sides of the political spectrum are okay about it, because it's fairly transparent. It goes to everyone, and that helps compensate if we have to charge the real price for carbon, not the artificial high price at the moment, which is caused by, if you like, failures within the market system for the production of, say, electricity, is a topical one. So I would argue at the top scale, we have to have different ideas about how we move money around to compensate from the fact that some businesses will be earning economic rents. They'll be earning unearned surpluses. And why shouldn't they give that, a proportion of it, as an unearned dividend to people, which helps with that second stage we've been talking about, which is to enable more local and regional production and consumption and exchange. It provides an additional income source there to do that, and to encourage people to get involved in that. The scale of the problem is probably illustrated by these quite pointed quotes. I wanted to put them in to finish with, from the publication, The Wealth of the Commons. At the moment, they claim we have a false idea of material abundance, commitment to permanent growth, and infinite accumulation. That's the idea, but we're not paying the real prices for these materials. We're not paying the real prices for products. We're not paying the real prices for moving them around, and we have limits about the amount of material that we could access over time. And at the same time, we have, they claim, the false idea of immaterial scarcity. We've got lots of innovative things going on, but so many of them are wrapped up in intellectual property, which prevents other people using them, or if they have got access to them, they don't have access to the capital that enables them to do something with it. So this is their last point. I think we can live with that one. I certainly can live with it. Any solution to contemporary capitalism needs to address these three issues in an integral fashion. Production that allows the continued survival, sustainability, and flourishing of the biosphere, protecting and promoting the free sharing of social innovations and knowledge, and the recognition that social and economic justice will not be achieved unless we first recognize the actual scarcity of nature and the actual abundance of knowledge and innovation. That's quite powerful. There's a reference in the slides to where you can get further information on that.